After almost 5 years in the making, the Bachmann early container flats are now finally with us. These wagons spent most of their lives operating with British Rail in the 20th century, and they represent a big hole filled in the world of model railways, as the only way to get into these wagons previously was to build a kit. Before we take a closer look at the wagons, let's have a quick bit of history on the real things. The shipment of freight across the world changed significantly during the 1950s and 1960s. Perhaps the most significant change during this time was the development of the shipping container. Without the shipping container, our lives today would simply not be possible. Before the container we know today, loading and unloading of freight was time-consuming and labour-intensive. Loading wooden crates, sacks and barrels could not sustain the growing demands of the world. British Rail recognised the need to innovate its freight transportation in the 1950s as it faced increased competition from road and air transport. Road transport massively improved during this time and was heavily subsidised by the British government. British Rail had to compete or face being left behind in the freight world. Fortunately, British Rail finally got the investment it needed, and in 1955 it began to implement the modernisation plan. The modernisation plan is huge and would cover a video in itself, but part of the plan was to improve the transport of freight, and the shipping container was recognised as being one of the keys to success in this market. Much experimentation with container transport was already up and running on British Rail, with various wagon types like the Conflat and the later innovative Condor freight service. However, these wagon fleets all differed in design, and many of the containers they hauled were of a specific design and would only fit on those wagons and those road vehicles that were designed to haul them. The need to standardise was clear, and British Rail set to develop a fleet of wagons that could haul a large ocean-going container to ports and terminals across the country. The wagons would be worked in sets as part of block trains, and they would haul goods for two different purposes. First was domestic freight, which was the shipping of freight within the UK, and the second is maritime freight, where the freight is shipped into or out of the UK's ports and unloaded at various facilities along the way. In 1964, BR's Shildon Works produced a batch of 4 prototype wagons. They were constructed of a skeletal framework carried on small-wheeled Ridemaster bogies. Keen to get going with its plans, British Rail ordered a production batch of wagons, and these were completed before the end of 1964. They were able to carry 3 20-foot containers each and had various forward-thinking items such as disc brakes and air-operated container clamps. At the time, a worldwide standard for attaching containers to vehicles had not yet been introduced, so British Rail chose to develop its own system, and this was used on the first batch of 100 wagons. Unfortunately for British Rail, shortly after doing this, the ISO standard for attaching containers to vehicles was introduced, and fortunately they were able to modify the wagons they had built to comply with the new standards. It was an unfortunate mistake, but luckily they were able to overcome it relatively quickly. The next batch of wagons were completed with ISO locks as standard. During the late 1960s, some small changes were made to the design of the wagons, and they now featured newer bogies that featured inboard brake discs mounted directly to the axles, and a change of livery to BR Corporate Blue. Production continued up until 1976, with over 2,000 wagons being manufactured. These operated nationwide until their gradual replacement by newer types during the 1990s and early 2000s. In 2005 it was still possible to find these wagons in service, but numbers had dropped significantly and they were becoming very rare indeed. The wagons were very successful in service and formed the backbone of the Freightliner network for British Rail. They remain the longest serving container wagon on the British Rail network. Okay, so here they are. Bachmann have modelled both types of the wagon, so in the background you can see there is the outer wagon with the buffers, and then we have the inner wagon in the centre. The wagons were operated in sets. I've opted to go for 2 5-car sets, giving me a total of 10 wagons, so I have 4 outers and 6 inners. The wagons come with a variety of containers in different liveries. a 20-foot Maersk box container, a 20-foot Stolt tank container, that being a fluid tank suspended in a frame so it can be used like a container, a 20-foot Mediterranean shipping container, a 40-foot evergreen container, a 20-foot cast container, a 20-foot Bell shipping container, and finally a 40-foot container also in Maersk livery. So quite a decent variety of containers there, and you can see in these shots here the detail is simply superb. The printing and the quality of the livery is simply much better than I could ever hope to achieve on my own using transfers. It's also a good variety of containers. We've got some different colours going on to add a bit of variation to the train. However, I would like to point out that the inner wagon comes with a 20-foot Maersk and a 40-foot Maersk container. Now, if you're modelling prototypical sets of these wagons, you're going to be buying more of the inner wagons than you are of the outer wagons. So I ended up with quite an abundance of the grey Maersk containers, and we'll come back to that later. The tank container is particularly interesting. It would have been easy just to supply another 20-foot box with the model, but the addition of the tank just adds that bit of variation, and it's something different. You can see the tank is incredibly well detailed and even has a prototypical weld seam down the length of it to represent the two halves of the real thing. Moving back to the other containers, again I will stress just how well the liveries have been applied to these. The printing is incredibly crisp, and it would have taken a long time to do all these various prints in the factory. Lots of different information printed on the containers in various fonts and colours, which all would require a separate process to do on the Tampo printing machine. So clearly a lot of effort's gone into actually producing just the containers. We haven't even got to the wagons yet. Plenty of detail on the ends of the containers as well. You can see all the various serial numbers and loading information on them, and some livery specific details such as cast cuts cost, which is an interesting little slogan that I didn't know the company used. And the same applies for the other containers. The ends are perhaps the best parts to look at. You've got all that detail from the doors, the rubber seals for the doors have been painted in black, and you've got all of that very intricate livery information printed there as well. If we look at the back of the evergreen 40-foot container, you can see that data panel on the bottom left-hand side. That decal on its own is absolutely tiny, but you can see all of the information is in there. The tank container is no exception, with plenty of printed detail on the ends. Okay, so let's take a look at the actual wagons themselves. You may be forgiven for thinking that, like most models, they are made of plastic, but because of the type of wagon that this is, it's a very low profile wagon. You as a modeler would want to run it unloaded in some situations, and because it's constructed of a skeletal frame, there's no way of hiding a weight inside it like you would have in, say, a passenger coach. So the frames of these wagons are actually made of metal. The bogie frames are made of plastic as usual, but the actual frame of the wagon is made of metal. It gives it a real nice weight, and I've been able to run some of these unloaded in my train as per the real thing without any derailments or issues at all. So if we take a look from the top down at one of the inner wagons, the first thing that strikes me is the fact that you can actually see through it to the whatever it is underneath. In most cases be the track and the ballast. That's quite a novel feature on a model railway. Most wagons have a complete floor, and you can't see any of the track work underneath. When these things are running, it's quite nice to actually look at just the wagons without the containers on them and see the track and the ballast moving past beneath them. There is plenty of detail on the wagons themselves. First thing we can see is the modelling of a inboard brake disc as per the later version of the wagons. There is also the close coupling system, which is specific to this type of wagon. We also have various pipes and hoses, I'm assuming,
We've also got an air tank and various other details to deal with the air system that operated, the brakes and the actual clamping system for the containers. We've also got a handbrake wheel, and you can also see the rods from the handbrake have actually been modelled as well, which is a nice feature. You don't see that on many models at all. There is some printed detail on the wagons as well, and as per the containers, this is very crisp and legible. You can also see some more details looking side on. The springs for the bogies have been painted a separate colour, and there's also a representation of the air hoses and various equipment that would run between the wagons. On this side you can see there's a builder's plate, which is a nice feature. If you get close enough it is just about legible, but this stuff really is absolutely tiny. It was quite difficult to get a decent focus on some of these bits because they're just so small. Here's a closer look at the handbrake mechanism. You can see the direction in which the handbrake is turned is actually printed on the side of the wagon as per real life, and we also have modelled the rods that come from the handbrake wheels, the mechanism in the middle that transfers that rotary motion into lateral motion to lock the brakes on, and we also have various other air pipes and details running down the length of the wagon that are extremely small and very fine to see. The small orange objects are the twist locks, and these are what would hold the containers down to the wagon in real life. These come on a sprue as part of the wagon's detailing pack, so you have to fit them yourself. Bachmann have supplied two different versions of this, the retracted position for where no container is attached to that particular clamp, and then the raised position representing a clamp that's actually been locked onto a container. This also doubles as a means of holding the container to the model, as it will locate into those small pegs. Budget some time for fitting these, as they are incredibly fiddly and very time consuming to do. However, I think it's certainly worth adding them. It massively improves the look of the wagon. Just like rolling stock from Bachmann in the past, the wagons feature a close coupling system. The close coupling system is present in two different forms. There is a very fine, delicate version which is present on most of the wagons on the ends where no buffers are fitted. It's very easy to fit the supplied coupling bar to this. It simply just clicks in. On the buffered ends of the outer wagons we also have a close coupling system, and this features your standard NEM pocket to take a tension lock coupler to couple the wagon to a locomotive. As long-term viewers of the channel will know, I dislike tension lock couplings as they are particularly unrealistic looking and somewhat unreliable due to the fact that nobody can decide on what size they should be, so I typically fit a KD coupler. In this case I've used a number 19. So there we go, some very well detailed wagons with some equally well detailed containers to go with them. My only complaint is that the inner wagon, as mentioned previously, comes with two containers in the same livery, and as I ended up with 6 of these inner wagons as I'm modelling a prototypical train, you can imagine I ended up with quite a lot of containers in the same colour. And although prototypical, it's quite common to see a block of ocean-going maritime containers all in the same livery, because they may have all come off a Evergreen boat or a Maersk boat or whatever. But I wanted that bit of variety, and the grey Maersk livery isn't exactly inspiring, it is a bit dull. So initially I decided to repaint some of these wagons into some different liveries to try and spice up the rake a little bit. However, that opened up a new problem, and that is livery research. Trying to find out the colour scheme of a shipping container from a particular time and company is surprisingly difficult. A shipping container is a very boring object, and obviously nobody really bothered to photograph them 20-30 years ago, so a lot of the crucial livery information for certain colours has been lost. Fortunately, there is a small company called Sea Rail International who I've been aware of for some time, and they do various decal kits to livery up containers. So I thought, well, that's a good idea. I'll go down that road, because there's no way I'm going to be able to do this on my own. Turns out they actually offer some ready-to-run containers as well, and they also model the older style of box container with the sort of recessed advertising panels at either end. So in the end, I ended up purchasing some ready-to-run items from C-Rail. They were reasonably priced, and they were already deckled up and liveried for me, and it would have been a very fiddly and time-consuming job to do, and my time is valuable, so I decided to go down that road. I still had to research what containers were applicable for the era I'm modelling, and I think I've got reasonably close, with a couple of exceptions. For example, the Maersk containers, they need their logo needs to be backdated. It used to have a white border around the edge of it, things like that. But I'm very pleased with the rake, and you can see these extra containers have really just added that extra bit of detail that I think it was missing. I've deliberately chosen to model a maritime container train, one that is on its way to or on its way from an ocean port. So you see most of the containers that are on the train would be the sort of containers that went on shipping across the world. If I was modelling a domestic train that was going from terminal to terminal within the country, then things like the classic Freightliner containers with the white and red detail, and then the later red and yellow livery would have been applicable, but I've chosen to model a maritime train that was on its way to a port. Okay, so that was my quick look at the new Bachmann FFA and FEA container flats. Very pleased with them, very well detailed, very well made. I haven't got a single issue, blemish or problem with any of the containers or any of the wagons. And the same goes for those C-Rail containers. They are also excellent, very well put together. My only real criticism is that I think Bachmann missed a trick when they spec'd 2 containers of the same colour to go on the wagon that is going to be bought in the highest numbers. Those of us that are representing a prototypical rake with several inner wagons between the outers will end up with lots of grey containers, and that is certainly not going to please too many people. Fortunately, companies like C-Rail are out there, and you can get other containers and other liveries, both new and old styles. Okay, so I will leave you with this last little bit. This is just me having a bit of fun on the layout with the wagons and the new camera. It's been a while since I've done a silly little clip where I've tried to sort of replicate an old British Rail promotional film. As the layout is set during 1989, I have selected the appropriate type of terrible music. So if you don't like it, you better turn off now.